Lord, good afternoon. Thank you. Thank you that you allow us to come back into your house tonight, this beautiful Lord's Day, this Mother's Day, when we are truly celebrating the blessings in our lives of the women that have done so much to cause us to become the men and women that we are today. We just thank you for your abundance of your mercy and your grace, and how you continue to encourage us and lift us up and just continue to give us wisdom and discernment, even in something as tough and as hard as revelation and end time. So you speak tonight as we dig into your word, and may we hear that still small voice as we try to seek what it is you're telling us here in May of 2021. And may everything we learn and hear tonight just be added to our testimony about who you are and whose we are in a dark world in which we live. And it's all in the strong name of your Son, Jesus Christ, that we make this prayer. Amen. Amen. The tribulation, otherwise known as the day of the Lord. Remember? Some people say the great and terrible day of the Lord, as we read in Malachi. It's underway. Now, last week we reviewed all of the signs Jesus gave us as to the present age coming to an end. The age we're in right now. We looked at all 9 of those signs, and we saw how many of them, we counted at least 5 of them, have already occurred or are underway. As we moved into chapter 6 last week, we said Jesus was the Lamb. He was the only one worthy, remember, to open the seals of that scroll. And we saw him opening the first 2 seals, the first 2 judgments, which focus on the Antichrist. The first seal corresponded to the Antichrist rise to power, because remember, as Jesus opens the seal in the throne room in heaven, he's giving permission for the man of lawlessness that we call Antichrist to ascend to the position he desires on earth. So he does something in heaven that automatically translates into something happening on the earth. The man that we looked at last week, remember, was pictured on a white horse. He had a bow, although we pointed out that it was without arrows, suggesting that he makes threats of war, but without actually having the means to carry it out. I equated it, remember, to Barney Fife carrying the gun with the bullet in his pocket. You can't do a lot of intimidating like that. Same way here. He is wearing a wreath or a crown. Remember the Stephanos, not the diadem. And the Stephanos is the kind of crown that gives the indication that he has a certain power base, that he earned it. He is not royalty. He did not inherit this. He worked for it. It's a power base that this man has earned, like we said in the Olympics, when you win a race and you get a wreath, you get a crown. As I indicated last week, these features sort of tell us that we have a military leader, you see there, who threatened military attacks on the earth, though he does not yet have the power to sort of carry that out. Not that they're empty threats, because he certainly does it through military might and intimidation. Then the second seal that Jesus opens moves the Antichrist a step further down his path of world conquest. The second seal pictured the Antichrist riding a red horse and carrying a sword. So you see, we move from a bow with no arrows to a sword, an obvious weapon of war that can cause harm. This seal resulted, we said last week, in widespread bloodshed, hence the red horse, and resulted in a world war, resulting from the Antichrist disrupting influence on world politics. If you recall, in Daniel, we learned about the little horn, that 11th horn. Remember, there are 10 kings that are going to rule at the end of the age as we enter tribulation. The Antichrist appears, becomes that 11th horn, that little horn. He somehow dispossesses 3 of the 10 kings and sort of takes over control of the world. That's sort of where we're headed here in tribulation. Now, these judgments may not sound especially devastating at this point, but if you think back to the worldwide devastation that World War II produced, it's similar. Remember, we said in World War II, 95% of the world was involved in that war. Then remember that we said last week these wars, according to the Olivet Discourse, are to be strengthening in intensity and frequency like birth pains. Remember? Birth pains. How they start out and how by the time you get to the end is so different. So they get worse with each new war. Increasing frequency and increasing severity. So this war will be worse than World War II that comes here in this time of tribulation. Perhaps because nuclear weapons will be involved. Imagine the bloodshed inflicted by a worldwide nuclear war. If they were involved. And we don't know that. We're imagining a lot of this. So this is a worldwide catastrophe. World War III, perhaps, that has no parallel today. The worst we will have ever seen on the face of the earth. And that leads us directly into the next seal judgment as we continue in chapter 6. So we covered the first 4 verses last week and pick up in Revelation 6, verse 5, where we read this. When he broke the 3rd seal, I heard the living creature say, "Come." I looked, and behold, a black horse, and he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard something like a voice in the center of the 4 living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not damage the oil and the wine." Jesus continues opening the edge of the scroll. Remember how we pictured the scroll? It's written on both sides. We said it was sort of a land deed of the earth. And instead of having 1 seal, it's got 7. So you open one of the seals and you can read part of it. You open another of the seal, you can read the next part. So that's the picture we have here. And each time he opens the scroll a little bit more and another seal, that's a new phase of calamity on the earth below. Once more, John is instructed to come, and as we said last week, that means leave where you are in the throne room and come over here and look down at the earth. You saw what the Lamb did, but look at what he is causing to occur on the earth. The cause and effect is what we said. And as he looks, he sees a black horse with a rider, and the rider, it says, is holding scales in his hand. And again, the rider is unnamed, which we've seen with the other 2, and referenced only by the pronoun he. And he broke the 3rd seal, and he who sat on it, he. So we know who that is based on what we've been studying. As we learned in the earlier 2 seals and 2 horses, the continuing use of a pronoun means that the character has not changed. I saw Mickey driving down the bypass. She was driving 70 miles an hour. We know who the she is in that incident, do we not? Same thing here. We know this is talking about the Antichrist, the lawless one. All right? So that's the constant reference. So we're still looking at the same person, the Antichrist. That means that we're still looking at the impact of the Antichrist rise upon the world scene as Jesus propels him up that ladder of power, so to speak. Don't forget where this is all starting. It's all starting in the throne room of heaven. Jesus opens a seal and something happens. This time the rider's horse is black, and like the red and the white horses, the color could symbolize many things, so we must consider its meaning in context, based on what's said about this horse, as well as the prior horses that we've looked at, beginning with what this man on the black horse is holding. The text there that John wrote says he has scales. Scales are not common in our modern culture, but when used as symbols, they typically refer to justice, the scales of justice. But the context here isn't of justice. It's not about fairness. So we really need to look to a more ancient meaning for this symbol. In ancient times, the monetary systems was based on bartering goods whose value was established by weight. So it was necessary to measure an exact amount in each transaction, and a scale would be used to establish and compare the value of an item for sale or a method of payment to a known value. I remember when I was a small child, we would go to the community grocery store. Our grocer out there that used to bring groceries, if I ever picked them up, he would have weights that he would put on his scales in the grocery store. And we would put bananas or whatever, and he would take and put one over here, and it would come up, and he would say 39 cents or whatever he would say. Same picture we've got here. So an object of a known weight is placed on one side of the scale, and another object would be placed on the opposite side, the balance, counterbalance. And when the scale is balanced, when they're equal, as you know, then the two sides are equal in weight and therefore equal in value. Secondly, when coin money was used, the coins were weighed to verify that they in fact contained the specified amount of precious metal, unlike today. Without this check, people would take their coins, the denarius, and they would shave small amounts of the silver off of it every time they used it. And so without a check and people shaving the amount off of the coins so they could save the metal for themselves, you imagine over time the coins lost significant weight through this cheating that they were doing of the merchants. And the shaved materials could be put together and spent again. So to keep the monetary system fair and the integrity of the monetary system in this day, merchants would weigh your coins before they would accept them. So if it's a denarius, they would put the denarius on the scale and something that was of equal weight. And if they balanced perfect, if not, they knew you were trying to cheat them a little bit. So the reference here to Antichrist holding scales in that context, I think points our attention to the economic impact of this man on the world as a result of his rise to power. And in this context, it clearly symbolizes him impacting the world's economy. That is, on retail commerce. And it's easy at this point to see a pattern sort of emerging. You have the threat of a military leader, a white horse, which becomes a trigger to actually engage in and start a war, leading to bloodshed, a red horse, then following this great worldwide war, bringing widespread death, devastation, destruction. We have the normal expected consequences, the interruption of normal daily life. That's what happens from a war like that. The onset of war always has devastating effects on the economy of the world. And the worse the war, the worse the impact on the economy. So the effect of a World War III, if you will be severe scarcity of goods, and then naturally as the supply decreases, what happens to prices? Up they go, they increase. We see the price increase reflected clearly in verse 6 as the world endures unprecedented inflation. John is told that a quart of wheat and 3 quarts of barley will each cost a denarius. And you see, that's about 4.5 grams of silver. That was the backbone of the Roman currency system, introduced way back in 211 BC. All right? It contained 4.5 grams of silver. A day laborer in first century Rome typically earned 1 denarius per day before taxes. So the laborer worked 1 day and was paid daily for 1 day's work with a denarius. Not the end of the week, not 2 weeks, not the end of the month. You work a day, you get paid. You work 2 days, you get paid for 2 days. In John's day, a denarius bought about 12 quarts of wheat, 36 quarts of barley, just depending on what you wanted, okay? 1 quart of wheat produces about 1.5 loaves of bread. 1 quart of wheat produces about 1.5 loaves of bread. That's enough food to feed a family for 1 day. Just to put this in perspective. So a poor family could subsist for almost 2 weeks on the denarius' worth of wheat, or even longer if they decided we're going to use barley instead of wheat. Now, by comparison, a laborer working at minimum wage today, let's say he or she would earn about $10 an hour, all right, $80 a day for 8 hours before taxes. A day's wage today spent frugally, $80 a day, can support a family with subsistence food for several days, maybe a week or more. But under the Antichrist, the world experiences runaway inflation for even basic goods. As a result of the Antichrist war, a denarius only buys 1.5 loaves of bread. And you say, okay, let me put that in perspective. That means a loaf of bread costs $60 in today's economy. How's that? $60 for a loaf of bread. Now, if bread costs $60 a loaf, how expensive will meat or cheese or other items be? You sort of see what's happening here? So we need to ask, what will be the impact of such hyperinflation? The answer is obvious because of what many people briefly had experienced in the early days of what we've just gone through, this COVID pandemic, remember? Panic. You know, I remember trying to go buy food or toilet paper, of all things, gone. people would call and say, if you see any, buy me some. All right? And in this day to come, expect rampant panic, crime, looting, ultimately starvation for many, because they're not going to be able to get the food. The Antichrist will produce these effects indirectly through the prosecution of war around the globe. This is going to be a global war, truly World War III. War naturally brings pressure on the food supply since it disrupts food production and distribution. We saw that with our pandemic. Armies consume large amounts of supplies. They sort of get first dibs, leaving precious little for the civilian population. So as that begins to occur, death becomes the norm, which is why we have a black horse. It symbolizes the death of many from a war-induced hyperinflation leading to global starvation. But as before, we trace this event to the opening of the seal, remember. Don't lose sight of where this is coming from. So what we're saying is the Lord permits these judgments to come upon the world. In fact, the voice of what the values of these things would become, according to what we read there in verse 6, if you missed it, look at it, came from the center of the throne. Did you see that? One guess who that is? God. That's God Himself establishing the stressor, if you will, on the world and its resulting effects on humanity. We know He is both the giver and the taker of life. He sets the day of our birth. He sets the day of our death before we are even born, we're told in what? Job, right? So what happens to us is in His hands, regardless of the methods He might use. Remember that as you think about these things, and don't put any judgment on God, because whether you die in your sleep or you die of starvation, you're still dead, right? I'm not trying to be cynical here, but the result is the same. That is not a difference with any value assigned to it, except we assign value to it because we prefer to die the way we want to die. Right? No significance otherwise. Think about how He took His own Son's life. So understand the method of death does not mean anything when reflected on God. All people die. Right? One time. Yeah, maybe. Right? Notice at the end of verse 6 that there are two products specifically excluded from these high prices, this hyperinflation. Wine and oil. These must not be Baptist, I'm assuming. Okay? It's not clear why these are excluded. The pastor would not appreciate me saying that, I'm sorry. It's just not clear why these are excluded, although many have speculated as to why. You can spend a lot of time searching out this exception some other place. We're not doing that tonight. And what people believe these two things mean. One answer I prefer is that these happen to be the chief crops in Israel. All right? Wine and oil. All right? And they come from grapes and olives, which represents Israel in Scripture. Remember, when we're looking at symbols, I don't think that's a coincidence. So this may indicate that the land of Israel will be spared to an extent from the warfare, which makes sense, since the Antichrist rise to power comes from what? What kicks off tribulation, remember? The covenant. He makes this agreement with who? Or whom? Israel. Duh, all right? That starts tribulation. So he's made this covenant with them. So this sort of makes sense that we're not bothering the oil and the wine because that's of the land of Israel. So for now, it seems that agreement with the Antichrist is protecting Israel from the war ravaging the world, at least for the first part of tribulation, maybe 3.5 years, so that they are not suffering under the same devastating effects of war as the rest of the world will be. Don't forget, though, they don't get off scot-free, because the whole thing is about who?
Jesus Christ.
Tribulation is about Israel, right? In the end. Why? Because they did not obey the old covenant. All right? They get it all. Deuteronomy tells us they get all the curses. We're not short-circuiting it. We're not stopping it halfway. It starts out light because you've made a deal with the devil, so to speak, with the Antichrist. All right? But in the end, it's about them. He's just not talking. He's just not taking it to them in this way yet. All right? We're only at the third seal. That takes us now to the fourth seal as we move into verses 7 and 8 of chapter 6, where we read this. When the Lamb broke the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature saying, "Come!" I looked, and behold, an ashen horse, and he who sat on it had the name Death, and Hades was following with him. Authority was given to them over a fourth of the earth, to kill with sword, and look at this, and with famine, and with pestilence, and by the wild beast of the earth. Now, the fourth beast, the fourth seal, brings one more horse with a rider, we're told. So we know we're still looking at this step-by-step impact of the arrival of the Antichrist. And so this is the last step in the chain here. But this horse changes the pattern slightly. Notice that? Because now the rider has a name. Death. The rider on the horse is named Death, with the addition of a follower, Hades. We're still looking at a horse with a rider and a series here. So there's still a connection implied with the first three seals because of the similarity of what we see. Colored horses, different riders. But the naming of the rider and the addition of a follower, Hades, sort of adds some intrigue, maybe some mystery. The addition of Hades has led some commentaries to conclude that really there are 5 horses here. But that interpretation misses the larger picture of what we're looking at. First, remember the pattern that was established with the first 3 seals. Each horse with a rider represented something the Antichrist accomplished on earth. They would open the seal, something would happen on earth through the impact of the Antichrist. The nature of the horse and other symbols reflects his impact, and each subsequent horse sort of builds on the prior horse. The rider on the fourth horse is Death, and Hades follows. Well, obviously, Death and Hades aren't people, aren't real people. Death is a condition, and Hades is a place. So the logical interpretation of the final horse is that we're seeing the final and ultimate effect of the Antichrist rise to power. He will bring widespread death upon the earth, and the effect of death for an unsaved, unbelieving person is what? Hell. Entry into Hades. And that conclusion is supported, if you will, by the horse's color and by what we're told here in verse 8. First, the horse's color is described as ashen. That's what it is in my New American Standard Translation. All right. In Greek, if you look it up, and I didn't put the word on the board, the word for ashen is chloros. C-H-L-O-R-O-S. Chloros, which is most literally translated green, from which we get the word chlorophyll. Chlorophyll. Ever heard of chlorophyll? Mm-hmm. The suggestion is of the color of a body many hours after death. Ashen, just pale green, all right, which could be described as pale green. This is not the natural color of any horse. So this color confirms for us that these horses are symbolic. I mean, we got a red horse, we got an ashen horse, pale green horse, symbolic. So the ashen horse represents the stench and the rot of many dead bodies left unburied. Mm-hmm. Secondly, in verse 8, look at this. We're told that the overall toll of the war, famine and pestilence resulting from the war, leaves how many people dead? A fourth of the earth. Mm-hmm. Now, I looked it up. By today's population count of about 8 billion people, this means 2 billion people die in a world war. 2 billion people. Now, by comparison, the highest estimate of the dead in World War I was 22 million. The dead in World War II was 56 million. This is 2 billion. Clearly, the next war will result in unimaginable devastation on the earth, just as Jesus' birth pangs suggest in the Olivet Discourse. That's the way it's going to come. It's going to get worse. It's going to happen more and more frequently, like birth pangs, and it's going to be more severe. All right? Increased frequency, increased severity. These deaths are the result of the combination of the first 4 seal judgments, as explained in verse 8. Sword, meaning war, which was the first and second seals. Famine, the result of war, which was the third seal. And pestilence, the disease that ordinarily follow famine and war, which is the fourth seal. And even, notice it says, wild beasts, who for lack of food become more aggressive, which is also the fourth seal. If the food's not out there, they're going to go find wherever the food is. If there's people in the way, they're just going to eat them. All right? Looking back on the first 4 seal judgments, they are obviously connected together as a group. So I want to show you how the pattern has been building. Starting back at the beginning with the first seal, that was the white horse, remember, which we said was the Antichrist coming to conquer, riding a white horse. Boy, wouldn't that just be like him? Then we have the second seal, which is the red horse, and that brings with it war and bloodshed. All right. Then we have the third seal, which we said was the black horse, and that is what brings high inflation and economic collapse, that hyperinflation. And then the fourth seal, the ashen horse, with famine, pestilence, wild beasts, a quarter of the earth dead, 2 billion people, widespread death. all four of these represent one man rising to power. So we group all of those together. They are obviously connected as a group. So I want to show you how the pattern has been building, starting back at the beginning with the first seal. Just remember our birth pangs suggestion. That was the white horse at the first seal, which was the Antichrist coming to conquer. Then we had the second seal with the red horse with war and bloodshed. The third seal, remember, was the black horse, high inflation, economic collapse. And then the fourth seal, as we said, was the famine, pestilence, wild beasts, and widespread death. What we're not going to see a horse again in any of the judgments to come, which tells us also these are special. These are grouped together. So we have a horse pattern at the beginning linking these sealed judgments. And as we look at that progression, it makes perfect sense why they're linked, because there's clearly something that's pulling you down this path, right? There's clearly some natural progression that follows. So these are simply cause and effect relationship, as this arrow here on the bottom shows us, of what happens when a man like Antichrist gets that powerful and begins to disrupt the world at that level. And we've actually seen this before. Not on this scale, but as I was thinking about this, when was the last time we saw a man like this with a similar pattern? Hitler. Sure, Hitler. World War II. Birth pangs. That's what we're looking at, but worse. He's just giving us the sign, saying, be on the lookout for this. So let's move on to the fifth seal in verses 9, 10, and 11. We read this. When the Lamb broke the fifth seal, I saw underneath the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God and because of the testimony which they had maintained. And they cried out with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, will you refrain from judging and avenging our blood on those who dwell on the earth? And there was given to each of them a white robe, and they were told that they should rest for a little while longer, until the number of their fellow servants and their brethren who were to be killed, even as they had been, would be completed also. So the fifth seal breaks the earlier pattern of horses entirely. And in fact, this seal also breaks the pattern of John being told, come and look, all right? Everything's different on this one. Instead, his vision remains entirely on the scene in heaven. Notice John describes the altar, meaning it is a place of significance in the temple. An altar is used for what? Sacrifice. So the presence of an altar in heaven tells us this is the place of sacrifice. And in heaven, the only place of sacrifice is the heavenly tabernacle. Remember? Hebrews 9, in our study of Hebrews, tells us that Christ is the high priest presiding over his heavenly tabernacle. And his blood was the sacrifice. And remember, in Hebrews we saw it is a once and for all sacrifice. One time. No continual sacrificing in heaven. That's the altar we're looking at here in the tabernacle. Under this altar, John says, what does he say he sees? Souls. which I'm calling martyrs. It makes it easier here for us not to lose sight. Meaning that these are in the form of disembodied spirits. All right? Souls only. We know, therefore, that these cannot be church saints. Why? Because all church saints will have physical bodies at the resurrection. Remember, we talked about that, which we witness in chapters 4 and 5. All right? That is, after the rapture. So these are human beings who died after the resurrection of the church, after the rapture, which means they died in tribulation itself. Secondly, it says they were killed because of the Word of God and because they maintained their testimony. See that? They are martyred for their faith. So clearly, these are believers, but we know that all believers were removed from the earth when Jesus came for the church at the resurrection. So that sort of produces a question and said, all right, Dean, how is this working? The church is gone, the Spirit's gone, and we got believers that are killed in tribulation. These souls are asking for justice for their deaths. So that tells us that they are obvious victims of an injustice on earth. Yet they are being told, sorry, the time isn't here yet. There are going to be more killed just like you. And we need to wait on all of these to come up. That means that faith has arrived back on earth in the days and weeks following the church's removal. So after the resurrection, after the rapture, somehow we've got faith back on the earth, which leaves us wondering how. How did faith come to the earth, especially since there are no believers to evangelize? Secondly, believers on earth during the tribulation will be targets for persecution, even death, right? They will be killed for their testimony, which must mean that a willingness to identify as a Christian in the time of tribulation is dangerous. Do so at your own peril. This is a worldwide truth in this day. Furthermore, these are merely the first of a larger number who must be killed for the same reason. That's sort of what he's saying. No, hang on. We got a lot more coming like you, all right? And we're going to have to wait. So what do we call martyred saints that came to faith and died following the removal of the church from the earth? Remember what we call that group? Tribulation saints. All right? Tribulation saints. And as we will see during the full course of this study, these saints literally endure hell on earth before they die. So never has it been more true that death is a blessing for a believer than it will be for these believers on earth. And so we must understand that this seal is not a moment during the 7 years, but this is rather a summary of the 7 years. You know, we've got things going on at the same time. It's sort of like reading a book. And as you read the book and you get to a certain point, when you open the next chapter, and they said, now let me give you some background or perspective on what all has happened. All they can tell you is what's going on then. But then they got to catch up eventually and bring you up to date and give you all the other things that are happening. That's what's happening here with this seal. A summary of the 7 years. That's why John is told to, or that's why John is not told to come and look. In other words, when Jesus breaks this seal, he opens the door for his followers to be persecuted and martyred during tribulation. And this is exactly what Daniel told us would happen back in Daniel 7. Remember when we were looking at Daniel 7 and the beast? Remember those 4 beasts when we studied it? In Daniel 7, verses 24 through 27, we read this. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings will rise, and another will arise after them. That other, remember, is Antichrist. Okay? And he will be different from the previous ones, and will subdue 3 kings. He will speak out against the Most High, and, notice here now, wear down the saints of the highest one, and he will intend to make alterations in times and in law. And they, talking about the saints, will be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. That tells us something. Anybody remember how long that is? Time, times, and half a time? 3.5 years. That's right, out of Daniel. But the court will sit for judgment, and his dominion will be taken away, annihilated, and destroyed forever. Then the sovereignty, the dominion, and the greatness of all the kingdoms under the whole heaven will be given to the people of the saints of the highest one. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all the dominions will serve and obey him. The persecution of saints isn't limited to a moment, as I said, or a certain group. But as the text says, there will be more coming. In fact, according to Daniel, this martyrdom of the saints will be concentrated in the second half of tribulation, the 3.5 years that the Antichrist is really in control. Remember how that changes at the halfway point. 3.5 years. So this sealed judgment represents the death of believers in the tribulation over the whole 7-year period. But it really doesn't get rolling until the second half. Right. When the Antichrist sort of says, enough of this worship for these Jews. I'm God. I'm sitting on the throne. You're going to start worshiping me. You're going to take my mark, and if you don't, I'm just going to kill you. All right? So you can see it's sort of dangerous for believers. This seal, in a way, provides a contrast to the 4th seal judgment. Remember, in the 4th judgment, death came to an unbelieving world. We know it was speaking only of death for the unbeliever, since the destination of those souls, it says, was Hades, who was following close behind death. The indirect cause of their death was the Antichrist leadership and the resulting chaos in the world. But the true cause of their deaths, the real cause, was Jesus opening a seal to allow that event to take place. Without that, it wouldn't happen. And now, by contrast, the 5th judgment seal shows death coming to the saints, the believers. Unlike those who go to Hades, these dead find themselves, notice, under the altar in the throne room of God, crying out for vengeance. I mean, how long have we got to wait? Come on. Aren't you going to do something about these, people down there? These 2 sealed judgments are set against one another. I think for us to make clear that both unbeliever and believer are dying in tribulation. Both. All right? The circumstances of each group's death are different, just as the destinations for the souls are different. But both the direct and the indirect causes of the deaths are the same. The direct cause of both is Jesus opening seals, which bring about events on earth. And the indirect cause is the working of the Antichrist on earth. His ambition, his aggression, all of that brings the war that kills billions of unbelievers. And his persecution of the saints, as Daniel just told us, brings about the death of believers. The fourth seal was everyone dying because of war. Remember? That's the fourth seal. All right. The fifth seal we put down on the bottom of our chart here because it's really not a moment. We can't say it just comes right here in chronological order. It just goes the whole gamut. This martyrdom runs throughout tribulation. So that's the fifth seal. It doesn't follow sequentially as if the war finishes and then we get into the saints dying. No, it's just a simultaneous activity. So it sort of goes underneath all the other ones we just studied. So while the Antichrist is out prosecuting war, he is also prosecuting saints. And those souls are then being martyred and end up in heaven, these disembodied spirits. So the martyrdom of saints is a continual backdrop throughout tribulation, as depicted on this chart. Brought about by Jesus' sovereign will to put his own people in position to witness and testify and die for that testimony. That's something he can do, right? You can make your life a living testimony, and you can make your death a testimony. That's how the world will start to see the impact of these seals being opened up. Now we move to the question of, all right, where do these saints come from if all believers were raptured prior to tribulation and there's no new believer that is sharing the truth? And it all traces back to God. We find that answer in the next chapter. Surprise. If you've read ahead, you know that. But first we need to sort of move to the sixth seal judgment before we get there. All right? So let's look at verses 12, 13, and 14 of chapter 6 where we read this. I looked when he broke the sixth seal, and there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth made of hair, and the whole moon became like blood. And as the stars of the sky fell to the earth, as a fig tree casts its unripe figs when shaken by a great wind, the sky was split apart like a scroll when it is rolled up, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places. Now, this also is a break from the previous seal judgments we've seen so far. So now, for the first time, we see a seal judgment resulting in a clearly supernatural change on earth. And increasingly, that's what we're going to start seeing as these judgments that God brings to earth take supernatural form. There will be a series of unimaginable cataclysmic upheavals of nature. The physical earth, the heavens, unexplainable any other way. It's just like the Old Testament prophets said about the great and terrible day of the Lord. Remember? They said it will be a day unlike any that's ever been or ever will be again. But it's important to realize that in the beginning stages of tribulation, the world will not see these as supernatural events. The natural events that God brings will be bad enough. But as the supernatural events kick in, beginning with the sixth seal, the world soon recognizes, these are coming from a God in heaven. But that recognition will not have the result you might expect, even though they realize that. The sixth seal brings earthquakes, devastation to the face of the earth, deadly objects falling from the sky, disturbances to the sun, the moon, the stars. We're talking, folks, about the sun going dark, the moon becoming blood red, earthquakes on the earth, supernatural calamities. The sixth seal judgment is the first of the judgments of tribulation, which come in 3 waves. All right? We're in the first one. Remember, we got seals, then what? Trumpets, and then bowls. Right? Seals, trumpets, bowls. At the end of each wave, we see this same climactic series of events with this outburst, if you will, of supernatural destruction. Sort of a kind of punctuation at the end of each one of these waves, just to make sure the people here get the point. Some of these events resemble things that happen today, earthquakes, winds, but of course nothing we've ever seen will come close to the destruction that the world will know during tribulation. The magnitude of devastation is simply unprecedented. And really, frankly, if you've read this, it's just impossible to imagine. So each series of judgments concludes with an awesome and terrifying display of God's wrath. All right? His earth-shaking power. In this case, the sixth seal judgment causes pronounced supernatural devastation. Besides a great earthquake, the sun, the moon, and the stars see dramatic supernatural changes. Look at the cumulative effect through this sixth seal. Here's what it is. So far, if you've lost track, 25% of the world's population is dead. 2 billion people. Mountains and islands move off of their place. Have you ever built a sand castle on the ocean and the wave starts coming in and you want to push it just a little bit closer to the land? What happens? You can't do it, can you? You know, it's like somebody told me it's like herding cats. Have you ever tried to get cats? I mean, you know, it's just you can't do that, all right? Tremendous upheavals in the physical structure of the earth. And we've got a new world leader, the Antichrist. And we just up through the first set of judgments. These are the seal judgments. We still got the seventh to go, which brings all the trumpets. Then we go through 6, and when we get the seventh one of those, then we got all the bowls. And these are all worse and worse and worse. Remember the birth pangs analogy. I want to look briefly at what happens to the sun and the moon and stars, because I think it's helpful to imagine them with some precision to understand what the text is saying here. Okay? Otherwise, it begins to sound a little too fantastic, like a fantasy. We really can't imagine it. And if we allow that to happen, it loses its drama for us. Each of these effects sort of pile up on top of each other. All right. First, we know that the sun becomes dark, black. This cannot simply be an eclipse, for an eclipse would be expected, right? We know when the eclipses are coming and we're ready. We're all outside looking for the eclipse. It would be unthreatening. That would not be a judgment, would it? An eclipse. And it would not create devastation. So it must be some other unexplained darkening of the sun, which then produces meaningful devastation on the earth. Now we'll come back to that. Second, the moon becomes blood red. This is an unusual one. And you're going to have to think about it a minute. The moon does not produce any light of its own, right? It reflects light from the sun. Good. So for the moon to reflect any color at all,
From us.
while the sun is dark and giving no light of its own, how do we explain that? The sun's dark, no light, and the moon is red.
Blood.
Blood red. That's miraculous, right? So the redness of the moon, absent the sun, is a warning to the earth that God is doing something dramatic and supernatural, because he just broke the laws of physics, folks. The moon has no light. It can't look blood red. All right? Next, we're told that the stars fall to the earth. But immediately we have to rule out a super literal interpretation here. We have to be careful, as I've said. A star in the universe, they tell us, is actually a sun, right? That's what a star is, a sun. And therefore, due to its size, a star could not literally land on the earth without destroying the planet, much less many stars all falling out of the sky. On the other hand, the context won't permit us to interpret this use of star symbolically, as we did in chapter 1. And we're going to say, well, that means something else. No. Remember in chapter 1 we said, well, the star is the angels, because that's what the text told us. The context here, look at it, is of the sun going dark, the moon turning blood red, and the stars falling out of the sky. Heavenly bodies. So we have to stay in context. That leads us to conclude that the word star is being used in the layman's sense rather than in the scientific sense of a distant star, a sun. All right? From the perspective of someone standing on earth, it appears as if the stars are falling to the earth, meaning these stars will probably be a meteor shower with meteors striking the earth with devastating effects. Then John describes the sky splitting and rolling up like a scroll, and mountains and islands moving. I don't know how we imagine that. I can't picture that. It just boggles my mind. A movement of islands and mountains, even over a short distance, would utterly obliterate anything on it or near it. The tremendous forces of such a movement is the example I gave you a while ago about you trying to move the sandcastle on the beach just a few feet to get it out of the waves. Just the act of moving it slightly causes it to crumble and disintegrate. Likewise, the movement of these large bodies of land, mountains and islands, would leave anything on their surfaces as just rubble. I mean, if there was anything even left. Some scientists have tried to understand what would happen if the sun suddenly stopped shining. And the effects match what we see here. The Earth's temperature would plunge in a matter of days to 100 degrees below zero. Right. And plunging temperatures of the Earth's surface would lead to hurricane-force winds around the planet. The atmosphere would undergo unpredictable and violent changes as temperature variations just swing widely. The sudden cooling of the Earth's surface would draw heat from inside the core to the Earth's surface, producing severe earthquakes strong enough to move continental plates and release magma. Meanwhile, to escape the severe cold, mankind would be forced underground trying to find heat, as John reported in verse 15. Look at what he says. Then the kings of the earth and the great men and the commanders and the rich and the strong and every slave and free man hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains. And they said to the mountains and to the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the presence of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come. And who is able to stand? Now, with all of that going on, the earthquakes would make the journey underground perilous. Can you imagine trying to hide underground with all of this going on? Notice in verses 15 and 16, everyone is underground. Notice who it says? The rich to the poor, the free to the slaves. Without the sun, even the homes of the very rich can't handle the cold or the earthquakes. And so they begin to wish that the rocks would just fall on their heads and put them out of their misery. In response to these events, humanity finally begins to understand what's happening. Where before the earlier judgments were interpreted as everyday human events, these judgments leave no doubt about their origin. In verses 16 and 17, the people say they are experiencing the wrath of God, and something interesting, and the Lamb. And the great day of wrath has come. Now, while it wouldn't take a genius to conclude that these things were the result of an unhappy God, at the point they're seeing these things, the statement still begs the question. It's one thing to say, oh, God made us. It's another thing to say, the Lamb is upset, and this is part of his judgment. How did these people, in the time of tribulation, come to understand it as a result of God and his Son, the Lamb? That's a very specific understanding, right? And would suggest that someone told them something. Someone explained it to them. Someone who knows Jesus. So who's explaining these events to the world? And who is explaining about Jesus, especially since the church is gone?
John. Is it John?
You're getting ahead of me, aren't you? That's part of what we get into in chapter 7. All right? As John takes a pause, it's like he sort of puts it on hold and says, I know you got these questions. Let me explain how this is working. Okay? Talking about the pause and the devastation and the judgments, and he begins to answer this question. Although part of that answer doesn't come until chapter 11. All right. That's the end of chapter 6. I'm a couple of minutes over my hour, so let's take a quick break. Bathroom, water, stretch your legs. We'll come back and do chapter 7 in just a few minutes, okay?
2 minutes?
Just a few minutes.